Today, we get to continue our lesson on the Industrial Revolution. So, last week when we did our lesson, we were focusing on the causes of the Industrial Revolution and just a little bit of what it looked like. What we'll be focusing on today is kind of what it looked like again, how it was for the people living through it, and then what were some of the consequences or what were some of the results that came from the Industrial Revolution. So, some of the earliest factories that we see during the Industrial Revolution were powered by water or by coal. This is really important because those two things are going to power the early Industrial Revolution. Either your factory was built along a river and you harnessed the power of a water wheel or something similar to it, or you had a steam engine powering your factory and you burned coal in order to make your factory work. This makes coal become extremely valuable, and many nations end up just digging up for coal and trading like crazy, making sure they have enough energy to run their factories. Most machines are too big to be used at the home or on the farm, and so they're only used in factories. So it's not like today where you might have some small machines in your house, computers, that sort of thing. These were pretty much only used in factories because they were so big, so expensive, and so difficult to use. But as a result of these things, factories were often located near water. They're going to be located for water for two reasons: power and transportation. So early on, the factories are there because they need the water wheels in order to have power to their factories. But then the other thing is the easiest way to transport materials and goods is to put it on a boat and put it through the water. So if you could put it on a cart and have a horse pull it, you can only get so much. But you can load up a boat and just float it down the river to the next city and find a lot of success. So that is why many cities in the modern world are built on rivers or access to water. Throughout all of human history, water is extremely important for transportation. That's why Memphis is right at the mouth of the Mississippi. It's why New York is in a harbor. It's why Boston is in a harbor. London, Paris, all of these major areas are located around bodies of water or rivers. Now, these factories are also going to produce large quantity of goods. So, unlike before the revolution, when people were just doing things for themselves in their home or they're doing it for a very small business, now we're able to mass produce things as humans. And so, you don't just have a factory pumping out a few things for the town, you've got factories pumping out tons and tons of materials and goods that they can then send around the country and sell to different people in the area. All right, so the steam engine is going to be important not just for factories, but also for trains. So there's going to be a new method of traveling and moving goods, and that's going to be trains. So during this time, you're going to see train tracks built all over Europe, train tracks built all over America, and then eventually they're going to be built around Africa and other areas as these industrial nations are trying to get their goods to people to sell them, and they need to get resources into their factories to be able to build things. So the steam engine is going to revolutionize travel because it produces the ability to have trains and steamboats. Much faster way to get across a large area, much cheaper, much more accessible for the lower and the middle classes. Unlike traveling before the Industrial Revolution, where you either walked by foot or you were wealthy enough to have a horse or something along those lines. Trains and steamboats really did increase the opportunities of not only the businesses, but also individual people trying to travel. Technology is also going to connect cities and countries and peoples in ways that the world had never seen before. Trade had always been a big part of human civilization, but never had they been so connected as they were during the Industrial Revolution. And no one would even dream the way we're connected today. I mean, here I am talking in a completely different room, and you guys are sitting here able to learn. So, the Industrial Revolution began this interconnectedness in the world that we've continued today after all this new technology has been developed. Now, one of the big consequences of the Industrial Revolution is urbanization. Urbanization is very simply the movement of people to cities. So, urbanization is the movement of people to cities. An example of this is in 1750, there were only about 17,000 people living in a city called Manchester. 30 years later, it had more than doubled. And there's no way that many people were born, right? It's not that they had 30,000 babies, it's that people were moving to the cities for opportunities. The farmers were losing their jobs. The farmers were no longer needed because agriculture was becoming so successful with fewer workers that those people needed opportunities. And so they moved to the cities to get jobs in the factories, providing factories with a very large labor force. And as cities are going to grow, there's going to be an increased division among the rich and the poor. It's going to be very obvious that you have extremely rich people and extremely poor people. But there's also going to be a rise in the middle class, people in the middle. Now, the truth is, during the Industrial Revolution, life was pretty hard for many people. But after the Industrial Revolution, most industrial countries end up having wealthier people than non industrial countries. And so this does end up being a good thing for the wealthy, the middle class, and the lower classes many times. If you were a poor person, an immigrant, or someone who had just moved to the city, it was very likely you were living in a building called a tenement, which is a multi story building divided into different crowded apartments. Think of it like an apartment in the modern world, but extremely crowded, extremely uncomfortable, and extremely cheap. Unlike modern apartments, you're not going to have running water, no sewage, no sanitation systems, and disease is going to spread rapidly. So let's talk about some gross stuff for a bit. One of my favorite things to talk about in this class is poop. Everybody thinks it's hilarious, but I find it extremely helpful. The problem is before you have indoor plumbing, right? If we were in class right now, you guys would ask for a bathroom pass and you get a hall pass to go to the bathroom. What if there was no bathroom? What if there was no toilet? What would you do? Well, what people did during this time is they would just do their business in a bucket and then they'd have to go dump their bucket outside. Now, if you live on a farm, that's a great thing. You can just go out in the field and dump it, no problem. But if you live in a city, where are you going to dump your bucket? And so they either would just walk outside their door and dump it in the street, or they would dump it out the window. And you can imagine how disgusting this is. And you can actually read stories of people living in this time talking about how there's just crap, like human feces, flowing through the streets when it rains. Um, and as a result, disease spreads. That's why in the modern world, we know to wash our hands after you use the restroom because diseases can be spread through that type of thing. And so, as there's this no sanitation and there's all these people crowded in these apartments, disease is going to spread rapidly, right? No social distancing at this time whatsoever. People are crowded together. There's no sanitation, low amounts of nutrition. And so disease is going to be a big negative point of the Industrial Revolution. Let's skip this for the sake of time. So the living conditions weren't the only problem. Early on in the Industrial Revolution, working conditions were extremely poor as well. Many workers would work long hours, anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day. That's twice as long as you guys are in school. Accidents were extremely common. Most devices didn't have safety features, they weren't that advanced. Most workers were extremely tired. And so when you get tired, you make more mistakes. It will lead to people losing fingers, breaking limbs, sometimes even dying on the job. And oftentimes, early in the Industrial Revolution, pay was very low, meaning that the entire family had to go to work just to survive mom, dad, children, everyone. So, oftentimes during the Industrial Revolution, I mean, as I mentioned, the entire family would work. And factories and businesses were encouraged to hire women and children because they were very economically valuable. So, I'm going to say a lot of things that I'm not trying to comment on the value of women and children in the modern world. I'm just going to talk about how they were viewed at this time to kind of help us understand why factories were so excited to hire women and children. During this time in those cultures, women were used to being told what to do by men. That was just kind of normal. It was acceptable that they could be paid less money for the same job, and they were just considered easier to manage. So, again, I'm not saying that's always true of women. I'm saying those were things that were generally accepted at the culture of this time. And so many factories were excited to hire women because it was cheaper for them to do so, even though women could be just as productive. Children, likewise, were extremely used to being told what to do because they're children. They could be beaten if they weren't doing what they're supposed to. They could be paid next to nothing, and it really was not good for children whatsoever. They were used in mine shafts where large people couldn't fit, climbing under machines, picking up things that were dropped. Oftentimes, children were permanently deformed. They'd have disabilities for the rest of their lives, and they would struggle. Orphans were a huge problem during this time as all these people moved to the cities and disease spreads. Many orphans or many parents died, leaving orphans behind to run the streets. Um, and the other problem is if all these kids are at work, none of them are getting an education. And so their future prospects are not looking so good because they're not able to improve any of their skills or their knowledge. So here you see some children workers here. You see the notice in that left picture that kid doesn't even have any shoes, right? Can't afford shoes, and his pants don't look like they fit right. So clearly he's not very wealthy. You see in the bottom a picture of these boys pushing a cart of coal as they are mining coal to provide power for these factories and the steam engines. Now, the lower classes were often unhappy during this time. They protest machines because of job loss, right? As a new machine was invented, fewer workers were needed. Now, long term, this is a good thing because those workers can go and do something else productive. But in the short term, it was very not good for those people. Early in the revolution, the lower classes were mistreated and they often lived and worked in very poor classes. But during this time, we see a very new thing in world history, and that is the rise in the middle class. So throughout most of human history, you had the common people and you had the nobles, right? You had a lower class and an upper class. Well, during the rise of the Industrial Revolution, we have a new middle class becoming very, very numerous. In the modern world, in the industrial world at least, the middle class is the largest class of people in most nations. That means there's more people in the middle class than there are in the upper class, and there's more people in the middle class than there are in the lower classes. So in this time, most of them are inventors or skilled workers, uh, managers in their factories and whatnot. They're going to live much better than the lower classes. They're going to eat and dress fairly well. They're going to value hard work and getting ahead. And they're not going to have a lot of sympathy for the poor because many of them viewed the fact that they had worked their way into the middle class as a benefit of their hard work and their values. And they viewed the lower classes as people who just weren't working as hard. And sometimes that was the case, but most of the time that was not true. Now, some major changes during this time. The invention of the steam engine is going to shift labor from humans to animals to machines. We talked about that last week. Inventions are going to continue to make life easier, manufacturing more effective, and farming easier and more successful. As people are making profits from their business and farms, they're going to reinvest, and this is going to fuel greater growth as more businesses and more inventions come from those investments. Inventions in one area often led to inventions in another. Just think about the internet. Think about all the new inventions that come as a result of the internet, from phones to apps, websites, internet-based business, all types of things. Transportation and communication is going to be significantly different during this time, and there's just constant new technology. Cities will begin to dominate the world as opposed to the agricultural lands. There's a new social order that takes place because of the rise in the middle class. It kind of changes everything. Now that most people aren't rich and most people aren't poor and people in the middle, it completely changes politics, changes culture, it changes society. Poor working conditions are going to eventually lead to new social and political movements, and we're going to get to that next week. Um, but we mentioned a long time ago that hungry people are unhappy people, and unhappy people rebel. Hungry people are unhappy people rebel. At this time, there's a lot of hungry and unhappy people, and while there's going to be unrest and they are going to rebel and have some protests and things, essentially what they're going to do is they're going to vote differently, and there's going to be new movements of politics and social things that changes the way people do business. There's going to be a great need for markets and resources. And so this is going to lead the industrial nations of Europe to go take over new lands. And we call this imperialism. And we'll study that here in a few new weeks. But basically, what that means is all of these factories needed materials to build their stuff out of. So they have to go to new areas to get those resources. And then once they turn those things into something to sell, they need people to sell to. So they go back to that foreign land to try to sell the people goods. But we'll talk more about imperialism later. So here we have a map of the industrial world in the 1800s, and we can see that in the top where it says Great Britain, that orange area, more than 1/5 of the land has been industrialized, right? More than 1/5 of the people are living in industrial cities. That's a huge change, and that's more pronounced than anywhere else in the world. You can see the rest of Western Europe in the purple, somewhere between 5 and 10% are living in industrial cities. And then in the rest of the area, we see it's less than 5%. So clearly, industrialization beginning in Britain and then spreading is certainly having a tremendous impact on how people live their lives. In the industrial areas, more and more people are living in cities, which produces new opportunities and new problems.